28-year-old Heather Bogle had just been through a couple of really hard weeks. And now, as the single mother looked up at the huge factory where she was about to spend the entire night building washing machines, she still just could not put the events of the past month out of her mind. It was April 9th, 2015, and Heather was standing next to her old car out in the parking lot of the largest employer in the tiny town of Clyde, Ohio, population 6,000. Directly in front of her was the entryway into Whirlpool Incorporated, a sprawling white metal and brick complex with a total workforce of 3,500 people. And once Heather clicked her way through that metal turnstile and entered the factory, she'd be walking out of the cool, clear, quiet evening darkness into an echo chamber the size of more than 30 football fields, all filled with sound and light and people wearing green foam earplugs and safety glasses. Heather had been working the night shift here for 2 years, and the steady paycheck and health benefits she received had made it possible for her and her 6-year-old daughter, Mackenzie, to afford a pretty good life in the town of Fremont, 9 miles north of Clyde. But, important as this job was to Heather, the young mom did not plan to spend the rest of her life working on a production line. Over the last few years, Heather had split her daylight hours between taking care of Mackenzie, catching up on sleep, and also going to school so she could achieve her real ambition, which was to become a licensed practical nurse. Now, Heather forced herself not to look down at her phone and reread the horrible text messages her older half-brother had sent her when Heather had recently gotten word that she'd failed one of her Ohio State Board nursing exams. But the real problem was, Heather didn't have to read those texts to hear them bouncing around in her head. Joshua had called her a dumb hoe who was too stupid to pass the licensed practical nurse exam. He'd signed off by accusing her of having low expectations and then describing her as, quote, typical trash like her mom and dad, end quote. And almost as bad as the pain those words caused was the fact that Heather had just broken up with the one person she could have turned to in this kind of situation for support and comfort. That person was Heather's ex-girlfriend, Carmela Badia. Carmela had been Heather's first relationship with a woman, and their 2-year-long romance had been intense for both of them. Before Carmela, Heather's longest relationship had been with Mackenzie's dad. Heather and Richard had met when Heather was 18, and even though they had never married, the two had moved in together right away and then ended their relationship 5 years later. Unlike Heather's breakup with Carmela, Heather's split from Richard had been a mutual decision. There wasn't much drama, Heather wanted to be free, and so did Richard. After that, when Heather and Mackenzie had moved to their house in Fremont, Heather was so busy and so focused on school and her daughter that she wasn't actively looking to date anyone. And when Heather first met Carmela at Whirlpool, Heather thought of Carmela only as someone she hit it off with and whose day shift overlapped just enough with Heather's night shift that the two of them would eventually strike up a friendship. But right from the start, Carmela had been open about her crush on Heather. At first, Heather had laughed about Carmela's good-natured flirting, but over the course of a few months, Heather's feelings for Carmela had deepened. But the stress of working opposite shifts and the differences in their personalities, along with mutual feelings of jealousy, ultimately took their toll. And in March, less than 1 month earlier, the relationship had ended in a storm of arguments, accusations, and bitter phone calls and text messages. Just the day before, Heather and Carmela had had one of their worst arguments yet, and Carmela had written Heather a long, angry letter that was now sitting in the front passenger seat of Heather's 2003 Oldsmobile Alero car. As Heather locked up her dark green sedan before taking her first step towards the blue awning that read Whirlpool, Clyde Operations, Carmela's words also sounded inside of Heather's head. "You duped me," Carmela had scrawled in ballpoint pen on the small-lined pages. "You have no idea how bad you hurt me. You're dead to me." A few minutes later, as Heather pushed her way through the metal roundabout before walking into the factory, all she could hope was that the next 8 hours would be so loud and distracting that the only thing she'd hear was the sound of metal and plastic appliance parts snapping into place. As a materials handler, Heather's own job took her to various parts of the factory. Using small vehicles called forklifts and tuggers, she was tasked with driving through the miles of factory space, collecting parts, and then delivering those parts to her fellow workers on the assembly line. But even in a workplace where 30 miles of conveyors clanked and rattled overhead, and where workers had to pay attention to what they were doing, Heather's friends on the production line they all shared couldn't help but notice that instead of her usual smile, Heather looked upset. And as Heather shoved the foam plugs into her ears and slipped on her safety glasses before stepping in behind the wheel of her tugger, she saw the looks of concern aimed in her direction. Checking over her shoulder to make sure that the little tow cart behind her tugger was securely attached before starting up the vehicle's engine, Heather found her spirits lifting just a little. She might not be able to confide about her recent disappointments to Carmela, but she reminded herself that she still had plenty of friends at work. People who were rooting for her to pick herself back up, to take that nursing exam again, and not give up on her dream of a better life for herself and Mackenzie. And between conversations with her friends over the course of the night, Heather didn't have to reply to any text message or incoming phone calls unless she felt like it. All the important parts of her day were already totally planned out, and everyone who played a part in her daily routine already knew exactly where and when they could find Heather if they really needed to. And it had been that way for more than a year. Heather's shift always ended just after 6 in the morning, and after clocking out, Heather would call Mackenzie's babysitter before Mackenzie headed off to school. Then Heather would head for her home in Fremont to sleep until it was time to collect Mackenzie at the end of the school day. After that, Heather could enjoy spending the afternoon and evening with her daughter before dropping Mackenzie back off with the sitter and leaving for work just before 10 p.m. Even now, when Heather was feeling down, just the thought of her daughter made her smile. Tomorrow's forecast called for cool weather and wind, but it was also supposed to be nice and sunny, and so if Heather made sure to bring along an extra warm jacket for Mackenzie to wear after school, the two of them could spend some time outside on the playground. Being out with Mackenzie was usually the best part of Heather's day, and Heather liked knowing that when people saw the two of them together, there was no mistaking them for anything other than mother and child. With her blonde hair and big smile, Mackenzie looked like a younger version of her slender mom, with the brown eyes, shoulder-length hair, and a scattering of freckles across a tan face. By the time Heather had begun her first circuit of the bright warehouse that night, the third shift had settled in for that night's work. Over the next 24 hours, the Whirlpool factory would turn out a total of 20,000 washing machines. And tonight, as Heather waved to her coworkers, being one of the team that produced those washing machines made her feel better. She might not be here for the next 30 years, but she knew she was lucky to have this job and have coworkers whose lives were a lot like her own. Other parents raising kids just like she was, people with worries just like she had. And by the time morning rolled around and Heather was throwing away her foam earplugs and pulling off her safety glasses, her usual smile was back on her face. Chatting with coworkers over the last 8 hours had been good. These sympathetic responses she had gotten had helped put Heather back into her naturally optimistic state of mind. She knew that once she saved up enough money to take the state nursing exam again, she would make sure that she passed it. Now, as Heather looked up at the clock and shook her hair out of its ponytail, the disappointments and hurts of the last few days didn't seem nearly as crushing to her as they had the night before. She knew her mom had sent her at least a few text messages, but Heather decided she would answer those later. For now, she had one more thing she had to do before she went home to sleep, and it shouldn't take long. Heather would wait to call her mom and babysitter once she had arrived back at her house in Fremont. A few minutes later, and Heather was pushing through the metal turnstile under the blue Whirlpool awning, hands in her pockets and head down as she stepped out into the parking lot and headed for her car. It wasn't until 2:33 p.m. that afternoon, 8.5 hours after Heather's night shift had ended, that Heather's mother really started to get worried. That's when Renee McLaughlin sent yet another text to her daughter asking if Heather was still planning to pick up Mackenzie after school. Renee might not even have bothered to send this text, since Heather always picked her daughter up after school, but earlier messages that Renee had sent to Heather while Heather was at work had all gone unanswered, and that wasn't like her daughter. Now, as Renee looked at her phone, waiting for Heather to text her back, Renee had to make a conscious effort to relax. Renee was still checking for Heather's reply when Renee got a phone call from another one of her daughters, Heather's younger sister, Jen. And as Renee listened to Jen explain what was going on, the worry Renee had been feeling tightened into a huge knot of fear. Now she knew for sure something was very, very wrong. It turned out that Jen, who was listed as Heather's emergency contact, had just been notified by Mackenzie's school that Heather had never arrived that afternoon to pick Mackenzie up. Jen also discovered that in another break from Heather's usual routine, Heather had not called Mackenzie's babysitter that morning before the babysitter had taken Mackenzie into school. After filling her mom in on the situation, Jen had hopped into her car and headed for Mackenzie's school. On her way, Jen used the short trip to call Heather's friends to see if any of them had heard from Heather that day. Meanwhile, Renee got on her phone and began calling other family members, including one of Heather's cousins who also worked at Whirlpool, to see if any of them had seen or heard from Heather. As soon as Jen had returned from school and dropped Mackenzie off with Renee, Jen and one of Heather's best friends began their own search for Heather. They printed out flyers with Heather's picture on them to put on telephone poles. They jumped on Facebook and other social media sites to spread the word about Heather's disappearance. Then the two women drove and walked around Fremont and Clyde, splitting up so they could cover more ground, stopping at Heather's grandfather's house before hitting every store or park or playground that Heather liked to visit. They also called hospitals, tow truck companies, and more friends. By 5:30 p.m., after arranging care for Mackenzie, Renee walked into the Sandusky County Sheriff's Department, 30 miles northeast of Fremont, and filed a missing person report on her daughter. The violent crime rate in Clyde, Ohio is among the lowest in the state, so any circumstance in which someone's life might be in danger was taken seriously right away. There was no 24-hour grace period or anything like that. Instead, it was instant action. And after hearing the pure panic in Renee's description of how out of character it would be for Heather not to pick up her daughter after school, the situation seemed unusual and suspicious enough that the sheriff's department acted immediately. Even as Jen and her friend were crisscrossing town searching for Heather, the sheriff's office issued an alert to local hospitals and other law enforcement agencies, as well as to the local news media. And before long, officers were driving over to the Whirlpool factory parking lot and surrounding area to search for Heather's car. The deputies also stopped at local bars and went to the home in a nearby trailer park to talk with Heather's ex and Mackenzie's dad, Richard. But it wasn't until 8 p.m. that evening, 40 minutes before darkness fell, that police got their first real news on the whereabouts of Heather Bogle. Without giving her name, a woman called police to report that she'd seen a car matching the description of Heather's older model dark green Oldsmobile sedan. And when police ran the license number that the caller gave them, they knew they had a match. A few minutes later, the first deputy on the scene called back to headquarters. He'd found the car where the caller had said it would be. It was in a parking lot that belonged to the Somerton Apartments on Hickory Street in Clyde, just a 5-minute drive from the Whirlpool factory where Heather worked. But any hope police had that they would find Heather asleep inside of her car or inside one of the apartments visiting a friend quickly vanished. The car was empty except for a black and white striped knapsack and what looked like a personal letter, both sitting on the front passenger seat. And when the deputy forced open the trunk of Heather's car, disappointment and worry suddenly turned to shock and horror. Inside the trunk was the body of a young woman. She lay curled on her side, dressed in jeans, pink and white sneakers, and an oversized red Mickey Mouse t-shirt that hid the 2 bullet holes in the back of her chest. The victim's knees were drawn up to her chest and her hands were tucked under her chin. Even in the small beam of the flashlight, the deputy could see that this woman had also been savagely beaten. There was also no doubt that she was dead. And it wasn't just the injuries to nearly every visible inch of her body that shocked the veteran police officer. It was the fact that her hair had been crudely hacked off in chunks right down to her scalp. And as the deputy moved the light so it shined down on her hands and face, he saw that her fingernails had also been cut brutally short right down to the soft flesh of the nail bed. Even before the family identified the body, the Sandusky Sheriff's Department knew that they had just found Heather Bogle. By the time Detective Sean O'Connell arrived at the Somerton apartment complex, the area around Heather's car had been marked off as a crime scene. The red paint on the front side panel of Heather's Oldsmobile, the result of bodywork to the car, was the only color picked up by the portable floodlights. But the detective, a veteran law enforcement officer with more than 20 years of service, hardly registered the yellow crime scene tape or the sounds and lights of emergency vehicles that were now starting to pour into the 230 block of Hickory Street. Staring down into the trunk of the car and slowly taking in the sight of what had been done to Heather's hair and nails, as well as to her body, the investigators' first thought was this murder was personal. Whoever had beaten Heather and then chopped off her hair must have been acting out of rage. The detective had already been told about a breakup letter from Heather's ex-girlfriend, Carmela, that had been left sitting on the front seat of Heather's car, and even without reading it, Detective O'Connell knew that Carmela was already high up on his list of people of interest. But at the same time, this looked like a crime of passion. There were also obvious signs that the killer had gone to great lengths to erase any evidence that might help police in this homicide investigation. Even before Heather's body was carefully removed from the floor of the trunk and taken to the county morgue for an autopsy to determine exact cause of death and to collect additional physical evidence, there was no visible sign that this car was the place where Heather had actually been murdered. There was no sign of a struggle, there was no sign of a weapon or bullet shell casings, and inside the well of the trunk, the jumper cables, a single white flip-flop, a spare pair of shoes, and a tangle of bungee cords next to a white plastic shopping bag from a Walmart store all appeared undisturbed. Instead, it looked to Detective O'Connell like Heather must have been murdered somewhere else and then dumped here. That way, police would not have an actual murder scene to investigate. There were other signs that the murderer had taken pains to cover their tracks. The neon green top that Heather had been reported wearing when she went missing had been replaced by the extra-large red Mickey Mouse shirt. The defensive wounds on Heather's hands, arms, and face all told police that Heather had fought back hard against her attacker, so the killer had cut her nails and her hair in an effort to remove any trace of the killer's DNA that may have transferred to Heather's body in the course of that struggle. After that, it looked like the killer had arranged Heather's body into this fetal position inside the trunk of her car before leaving the vehicle and Heather's body in this poorly lit parking lot outside the cheaply built 2-story apartment complex. Crime scene techs would later confirm Detective O'Connell's initial impression of the crime scene. Despite a careful examination of the trunk interior, they found no usable forensic evidence. And a later autopsy report would estimate that Heather had been murdered much earlier in the day, probably within a few hours of the Whirlpool video surveillance tape that would show Heather leaving the Whirlpool factory at 6:17 a.m. that morning of Friday, April 10th. That same autopsy would also reveal that Heather had ultimately been killed by 2 gunshot wounds to her back. But in a huge break for law enforcement, despite the killer's effort to erase any connection to the crime, the medical examiner would find small amounts of what police assumed was the killer's DNA buried under what little remained of Heather's fingernails. When Detective O'Connell finally looked up from his own visual inspection of Heather's body curled up in the trunk of her car, he noticed one of the residents of the 48-unit complex in front of him standing outside her apartment door, watching the police do their work. That person was 24-year-old Kiona Boer, an African-American woman raising 2 children on her own, who had already had at least one run-in with the Sandusky Sheriff's Department's all-white detective bureau. After making sure the crime scene had been properly secured and processed, Detective O'Connell gave orders for police to start canvassing the area for information about the driver of the green car. He also set in motion interviews with personnel at Whirlpool, as well as with Heather's family and friends. Meanwhile, after taking a final look down at the police activity in her parking lot, Kiona stepped back into her apartment, then carefully closed and locked the door behind her. Over the next 2 weeks, Detective O'Connell reported to the local media and to Heather's family that the sheriff's department was making good progress on their investigation into Heather's murder. While he was not ready to make any arrests, the lead detective said investigators had ruled out several key suspects who had close ties to Heather. Although she was among the first to be interviewed as a person of interest, Detective O'Connell quickly checked Carmela Badia off his suspect list. As far as he was concerned, Carmela, who had clocked into the Whirlpool factory for her day shift just half an hour after Heather was seen leaving the factory, just didn't have enough time to commit this murder. He also did not believe Carmela would have tried to cover her tracks, but still leave that breakup letter she had written to Heather in the front seat of Heather's car. Also in the clear were Heather's ex-boyfriend, Richard, and Heather's older brother, Joshua. In addition to having an alibi for the time of the murder, Joshua explained to police that the degrading texts he had sent his half-sister shortly before her death were just his way of motivating Heather to do better on her nursing boards next time she took them. He described his insults as being, quote, tough love. But almost from the start of the investigation into Heather's death, it would turn out that Detective O'Connell had formed a theory of the crime that would lead him from one dead end to another. When toxicology tests on Heather's body eventually revealed a small amount of marijuana in her bloodstream, Detective O'Connell became totally convinced that Heather's murder was drug-related, and that Heather's murderer or murderers were all connected to the young African-American woman who had stood outside of her apartment watching police work the crime scene on the night of April 10th, when Heather's body was first discovered. Detective O'Connell's suspicions were based on his theory that Heather had driven to the apartment complex after work in order to purchase drugs. And years earlier, Detective O'Connell had arrested the father of one of 𝗙𝗓𝗎 children, a man named Omar Satchel, on drug charges. Police had also been informed that before Heather's murder, 𝗙𝗓𝗎 had been seen wearing a large-sized red Mickey Mouse shirt that might match the shirt Heather was wearing when her body was discovered, and that there was still a close association between 𝗙𝗓𝗎 and Omar. By April 17th, 1 week after Heather was murdered, police had conducted 2 searches of 𝗙𝗓𝗎's unit at the Somerton apartment complex. Police had also arrived in force and with guns drawn at the nursing home where 𝗙𝗓𝗎 worked to obtain a DNA sample. Even as other tips and potential leads in the case trickled in to the sheriff's office, Detective O'Connell continued to focus his effort on building a case against 𝗙𝗓𝗎, Omar Satchel, and a third African-American man who the investigators suspected of owning the gun that was used to kill Heather. Meanwhile, Heather's family and friends held a series of vigils in her honor and started raising money that would go to Heather's daughter, Mackenzie. But as the investigation into Heather's death dragged on for more than 12 months without any arrests or hard evidence against Detective O'Connell's chief suspects, Heather's sister, Jen, was not the only person complaining to the media and the sheriff that Detective O'Connell was mishandling the murder investigation. And then, in September 2016, 17 months after Heather's murder, Detective O'Connell announced that he was resigning from the Sandusky Sheriff's Department to take a job as a manager of a McDonald's fast food restaurant. Sean O'Connell's decision came several months after his prime suspects had all broken their silence, not only claiming that they had nothing to do with Heather's murder, but also pointing out that they had never even met Heather and had no personal ties to her whatsoever. To prove their claim, the suspects volunteered tissue and DNA samples, they stated their willingness to take lie detector tests, and pointed to the alibis they had provided police. They also accused the sheriff's department of racial profiling, which is targeting individuals for suspicion of crime based on the individual's race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin. Just before his resignation, Detective O'Connell himself had been placed on 3 months of paid leave, and the murder investigation had been turned over to the Ohio Bureau of Investigation. And at the same time, Kyle Overmeyer, Sandusky's sheriff and Detective O'Connell's boss, admitted to opiate addiction and was charged with stealing prescription drugs from lockboxes at area police stations. Stunned, Heather's family and friends watched as the state stepped in and tried to pick up the pieces of the murder investigation. To them, and to the frightened residents of Clyde and Fremont, it looked like a bungled investigation by a corrupt and possibly racist sheriff's office would result in one of the most vicious murders ever committed in Northwest Ohio turning into a cold case. In November of 2016, 19 months after Heather Bogle's murder, the voters of Sandusky County voted in a brand new sheriff. And when Police Lieutenant Chris Hilton stepped into that office 2 months later, in January of 2017, one of his first moves as sheriff was to appoint a new detective who would be charged with starting the Heather Bogle murder investigation all over again from scratch. And that new detective, Nick 𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗢𝗧, did not waste any time following those orders. With 18 years experience in law enforcement, this would be the 11th homicide that Detective 𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗢𝗙 had investigated. And even though he was basically treating Heather's murder as a cold case, the detective was coming at the homicide from a different direction than former investigator Sean O'Connell. He would follow the hard evidence wherever it took him, but he was also interested in talking with people and potential suspects who had a personal connection to Heather. He also wanted to find out exactly where Heather was killed. And after going through the complete file on Heather's murder, it didn't take long for the new lead investigator to totally rule out Sean O'Connell's top 3 suspects. Not only was there absolutely no physical evidence to connect them to Heather's death, it turned out none of their DNA matched the tissue sample that the medical examiner had found under Heather's nails, an important detail that former Detective O'Connell had left out of his reports on the case. Those DNA results would also rule out, once and for all, Heather's ex-girlfriend Carmela and Heather's half-brother Joshua. Once he had cleared all the past suspects in Heather's murder, the new investigator went back through the tips that former Detective O'Connell had received from Heather's coworkers, but never followed up on. The investigator also found several search warrants related to collecting possible evidence in Heather's death that former Detective O'Connell had not executed. Those warrants included one that allowed the investigator access to Heather's computer and to all the location data collected from Heather's devices, including her phone, that was collected and stored in her various Google applications. Designed by the technology giant Google, those applications included Heather's email account, as well as a social connection program called Google Hangouts that allowed the user to send their GPS location to their contacts. In order to do that, Google Hangouts used Heather's phone to track her real-life location. Heather's records showed that the last ping from Heather's cell phone before the battery died came in at 9:20 a.m. on April 10th, 2015, 3 hours after Heather was last seen on that security footage that showed her leaving the Whirlpool parking lot at 6:17 on the morning she disappeared. Using Heather's cell phone records, investigators were able to narrow her whereabouts between 6:17 a.m. and 9:20 a.m., but they could only place her location during those critical hours within a radius of about 5 miles from the cell phone tower. So it wasn't until the investigator overlaid that data with the GPS coordinates of Heather's cell phone that had been collected by her various Google accounts, all of which Heather had left open, that Detective 𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗢𝗙𝗢𝗢𝗢 finally hit pay dirt. A map of all those GPS coordinates allowed investigators to pinpoint with much greater accuracy the location of Heather's cell phone on the morning that she went missing. On May 26, 2017, just over 2 years after Heather's murder, Detective 𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗢𝗙𝗢𝗢𝗍 and his investigation team left the Sandusky Sheriff's Department and made the 40 minutes drive south to a place called Emerald Estates Trailer Park, located in Green Creek Township. Their destination was a white trailer located at the bottom point of an important triangle. The home, with the wooden porch built off the side, was located 13 minutes and 6 miles southwest of the Whirlpool factory in Clyde, where Heather had worked, and 9 miles and 17 minutes southeast of Fremont, where Heather had lived with her little daughter Mackenzie. When police arrived at trailer number 79, the resident and owner of the trailer looked surprised to see them, but invited them to come inside. Yes, this person told Detective 𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗢𝗙𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗙 they'd be more than happy to answer any questions about Heather Bogle, even though the person had hardly known her. It wasn't until the owner of trailer number 79 refused to volunteer a DNA sample that Detective 𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗢𝗙𝗢𝗢𝗢 felt the adrenaline surge through his body. He was suddenly sure that the 25-month-long search for Heather's killer was finally over. Based on evidence that Detective 𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗢𝗙𝗢𝗢𝗢𝗢 and his team would collect over the next few days, here is a reconstruction of what police believe really happened to 28-year-old Heather Bogle after she left work more than 2 years earlier on Friday, April 10th, 2015 at 6:17 in the morning. Heather's killer had an eye for vulnerable women. He also had an eye for attractive women who played up their femininity. He liked painted fingernails, and he liked that Heather had that nose piercing and wore that sparkling stud that brought out her brown eyes. He liked that she didn't eat Doritos with her fingers because she didn't want to get the red seasoning from the corn chips all over her hands. But on the night of April 9th, when Heather arrived at work without her usual smile and with stress written all over her face, what Heather's killer liked most of all was the fact that Heather was so obviously upset. And when their paths crossed at work that night on the manufacturing line, as they had every night for more than a year, Heather's killer made it a point to find out exactly what was bothering his popular and trusting young coworker. Over the next 8 hours, Heather's killer gathered up each crumb of information, receiving each one with a look of sympathy: how Heather had failed one of her nursing exams, how her own brother had just sent her text messages calling her too stupid to pass, how she would have to go back to studying for the tests all over again and save up the hundreds of dollars it would cost her to retake the state exams. And by the time Heather's night shift was over, Heather's killer had persuaded her to stop by his house after work. He was pretty sure he had some books on human anatomy and biology that might help with Heather's next round of study. He told her where he lived and how easy it was to get there. So, after leaving the Whirlpool factory parking lot at 6:17 a.m., Heather hopped into her dark green car with the bright red front side panel and began the short drive to Emerald Estates trailer park. There was no need to call her mom or babysitter. Heather expected this visit would be a short one, and if it delayed her at all, it would only be for a few minutes. She could return her mom's text messages and call the sitter on her drive back to Fremont. When Heather pulled up outside of the white trailer marked number 79, Heather saw her coworker's car in the driveway. So, after parking her Alero, she hopped out and walked up the 4 wooden steps leading to the covered porch and knocked on the front door of the trailer. Heather only had to wait a second before the door was open, and with a smile of thanks, Heather stepped inside. As soon as the killer had closed the door behind his visitor, he didn't waste any time on any more conversation with Heather about her recent setbacks. He also did not have any study guides that would help her pass her next round of exams. Instead of collecting nursing textbooks, Heather's killer was a man who had spent a lot of time building a home video library that showcased his taste for violent sex and for non-consensual bondage and domination. And what he wanted now, very badly, was to have sex with Heather. But instead of accepting his advances, welcoming the way he leaned into her, getting too close and reaching out to pull her towards him, Heather was confused and repelled, saying no to his advances and then pushing him away. The man in front of her was 46 years old. That was 18 years older than she was, and Heather's last relationship had been with a woman. But even as the creepiness and then danger of the situation fully registered with Heather, it was too late. Because now, the man in front of her was both enraged and excited by Heather's rejection. In that moment, the killer's need to have sex with Heather, an act that might leave traces of his DNA inside of her, had changed to something else, an overwhelming desire to control and punish her. But Heather was a fighter, and despite the fact that she was hopelessly outweighed and overpowered by her much larger and stronger attacker, Heather responded to the assault by hitting her killer so hard that she broke one of his teeth and cracked another. But over the course of that morning, Heather would pay for her bravery. The autopsy on her body that would be performed the next day would include a long catalog of injuries to all parts of Heather's body. Ligature marks on her wrists and ankles showed that she had been tied up. There were also curved red lines on the left side of her neck where she may have been whipped with a cord or had the cord wrapped around her throat. Heather's face, jaw, eyelids, forehead, and legs were covered with bruises, and even her tongue showed signs of bite marks and lacerations. Her hands and arms were dotted with round red defensive wounds caused by blunt trauma. And when the killer was finished with his savage torture and beating, he left her on the floor and then came back with his .380 Cobra small caliber handgun and fired 2 shots into Heather's back, injuries that collapsed her lungs and caused almost immediate death. But even though Heather's resistance had enraged her killer, it was that decision to fight for her life that would eventually help police identify her killer. Before arranging Heather's lifeless body in the trunk of her green car, the killer pulled off her green neon top and replaced it with an extra-large red Mickey Mouse t-shirt. And then, in what police believe was an effort to destroy any physical evidence that could tie him to the murder, the killer also hacked Heather's shoulder-length hair off at the roots and cut her fingernails down to the quick. But Heather had fought so hard that traces of her attacker's DNA had been pushed underneath the cuticles that covered the bottom of her fingernails. It would be just enough to give police the tissue sample they would later use to help convict her killer. After abandoning Heather's car, with Heather's body locked in the trunk, at the Somerton apartment complex, the killer sat back to wait and to build his cover of innocence. He made sure that he went to Heather's funeral and signed the guest register expressing his grief alongside so many of Heather's other co-workers from Whirlpool. He also pulled up and replaced the flooring in his trailer where police believe Heather had been shot and killed. And when Heather's family set up a GoFundMe page for Heather's daughter, Mackenzie, 44-year-old Daniel Myers, a 17-year veteran of Whirlpool, who had worked right alongside Heather on the factory's production and material handling lines, made a donation of $125. On that same GoFundMe page, Daniel, who had been arrested on a domestic assault charge in 2001 and another assault charge in 2004, posted this message, quote, "Heather, you were such an amazing person. I am distraught that there will be no more of your smiles at work. You will always be in my thoughts. Your daughter will always be in my prayers. God bless you, little Missy." End quote. It would turn out that on May 26th, when Detective Nick Kotsopoulos and his team headed to trailer number 79 in Emerald Estates Trailer Park, they were following the location coordinates they had found stored in Heather's Google accounts. It had been an electronic trail, there ever since the day of Heather's murder, that followed the young mother from the Whirlpool factory in Clyde on the morning of April 10th, 2015, to the actual scene of her murder. And during that first interview with Detective Kotsopoulos, when Daniel Myers told police he hardly knew Heather and then refused to volunteer a DNA sample, the investigator knew right away that he had a brand new prime suspect in the murder of Heather Bogle. As for Daniel Myers' broken tooth, he told investigators it was nothing and that he'd fixed it himself using superglue. In the days immediately following that first interview with Daniel Myers at trailer number 79, investigators were able to get a search warrant that compelled him to give police a DNA sample. Police also got a warrant to search his house, where they found guns, videotapes of violent sexual encounters, and under the carpet, new sections of flooring that had been installed within a week of Heather's disappearance. On June 1st, after lab tests matched Daniel's DNA to the tissue found under Heather's cuticles, Daniel Myers was arrested and charged with aggravated first-degree murder, robbery, and kidnapping in the death of Heather Bogle. Immediately after Daniel Myers' arrest, 10 women came forward to report that they had been raped by Daniel Myers. But it would turn out that Daniel Myers would not be the only person in the Heather Bogle homicide investigation who would face criminal charges. On December 13th, 2018, a little over a year after Daniel Myers' arrest, former detective Sean O'Connell was sentenced to 2 years in prison for actions related to his investigation into Heather's murder. Those charges included tampering with and falsifying evidence and sharing confidential murder files with members of the public. It would turn out that former detective O'Connell had pursued his case against Kiona Boer, Omar Satchel, and a third African-American suspect even after he knew that their DNA did not match the DNA found under Heather's fingernails. As a result of being singled out as a murder suspect, Kiona Boer would lose her job and apartment, and she and her school-age son would both become the target of hate and bullying. Former Detective O'Connell was also criticized for delaying justice. Just days after Heather's murder, Sean O'Connell had received an email tip from a woman who worked at Whirlpool telling police she knew of one employee who she believed, based on her own encounters, would be capable of committing murder, and that man's name was Daniel Myers. Detective O'Connell also failed to execute the search warrant he had early on in the Heather Bogle investigation that would have given him access to the Google accounts that had stored a record of Heather's movements from the time she left work on the day of her murder until her phone died 3 hours later. On February 13, 2019, almost 4 years after Heather's death, Heather's co-worker Daniel Myers pleaded guilty to murder in order to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But before the judge issued that sentence, there was one final twist in a murder case that had generated headlines across the state and that would become the subject of several true crime documentaries. Just days after Daniel Myers was arrested in 2017, investigators reopened an older case involving the death of Myers' ex-girlfriend, 37-year-old Leanne Sluter. Back in 2009, 6 years before the murder of Heather Bogle, Daniel Myers told police he had discovered Leanne lying dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in the bedroom of a trailer he owned. At the time, police did not question Daniel's account or treat the death as suspicious, even though Leanne's family wanted Daniel questioned as a suspect. Ultimately, the new investigation into Leanne's death turned up a suicide note in the victim's handwriting that was provided by Daniel Myers' family. But although the Leanne Sluter investigation ended without another charge of murder, Leanne Sluter's family insist that if police had done a thorough investigation into Leanne's death and questioned Daniel Myers as a suspect back in 2009, Heather Bogle would still be alive today. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. One night in November of 1999, a deputy was driving along a remote mountain road in Southern California when he spotted a car pulled off to the side of the road up ahead. Now, this car's engine was still running, and the passenger side door was clearly wide open, but there didn't appear to be anyone inside the car. Now, this was a very remote road, so the deputy assumed the driver must be having some sort of car trouble, because otherwise, why would they stop here? So the deputy pulled over, hopped out of his cruiser, and began walking towards this car to see if he could help. But before the deputy reached the car, he noticed something dangling out of the passenger side door. The deputy reflexively put his hand on his holster and walked slowly the last few feet up to the car. And when he finally actually got to see inside of this car, he just froze. It looked like a set from a horror movie, except this was not fake. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button is fast asleep, slowly pull the blankets off their feet, exposing them to attack by monsters. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of November 19th, 1999, Carolyn Stahl had an extra bright smile on her face as she saw her patients at her eye clinic in Long Beach, California. Sure, it was another busy and hectic Friday, but it was also Carolyn's 44th birthday, and her husband Ken was going to take her out to dinner the next night to celebrate. In many ways, Carolyn and Ken Stahl were a classic Orange County power couple. She was an optometrist, and he was an anesthesiologist at a nearby hospital. They lived in a condo in a gated community, and Carolyn's interior design talents had made their home the envy of all their friends. And with no children at home, Carolyn and Ken liked to spend their money on things like expensive clothes, travel, and extravagant hobbies, like Ken's antique sword collection. But even with all that wealth, Carolyn had always remained down to earth. She was sweet to her friends, and she remembered their birthdays and other special occasions with cards and gifts. She talked to her mother back in her native Michigan at least twice a week, and she was planning a trip back home for the holidays to see her. And Carolyn took special care of Ken and always made sure he had whatever he needed. Carolyn even picked out the seeds from Ken's watermelon because she knew he couldn't stand them. Carolyn remained in a great mood that day as she gave eye exams to one patient after another. And it was the first time in a while she'd felt like everything was going well in her life, because she and her 57-year-old husband, Ken, had been through a lot that year. Ken had been having heart problems, and a few months earlier, he had undergone an 8-hour operation to restore proper blood flow. The surgery had left Ken feeling weak and depleted for months in a way Carolyn had never seen before. Carolyn knew that bad hearts ran in Ken's family. His father had died from a heart attack, so she really didn't take her time with her husband for granted. And recently, Ken had finally started feeling much better, and he told Carolyn how excited he was to go out with her for her birthday. And so Carolyn was so excited. Ken planned to take them to a Mexican restaurant in the pretty town of 𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙, and then after dinner, they'd go on a romantic stroll near the historic Spanish mission in the area, and Carolyn thought this was a perfect way to celebrate her birthday, and to celebrate a new start for the couple. The following day, Saturday, November 20th, Ken was busy getting ready for his and Carolyn's big night out, and he really wanted everything to go perfectly. If Carolyn was sweet and sociable, Ken was intense and ambitious. He always felt like he was following in his father's footsteps and not quite measuring up. Ken was the only son of a prominent anesthesiologist who had once owned a hospital and made the news all the time. By comparison, Ken had only managed to get himself appointed to an obscure medical board, and he never seemed to fly quite as high as his father. Ken was really close to his mother, but he suspected that even she thought his career was less impressive than his father's had been. Ken also had this growing sense that he was running out of time. He worked out like a maniac to stay fit, and routinely went on 25-mile hikes and day-long bike rides. He was naturally athletic and had gone to college on a football scholarship, but Ken knew he had very likely inherited his father's heart problems, and so he was unlikely to live to a ripe old age. But this really only served to make Ken more driven to succeed in the time that he had. But on that particular Saturday, as Ken got ready, he actually found himself feeling quite relaxed. And when Carolyn walked into the room he was in, wearing a pretty red dress and seemingly all the gold and diamonds she owned, Ken just stared and smiled. Ken finished getting ready, then took his wife's hand, and they walked outside together. They got into Ken's car, pulled out of their gated community, and set off on the 25-mile drive to 𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗙𝗏 for their big birthday dinner date. At 10 p.m. that night, Deputy Tony Castillo of the Orange County Sheriff's Department was in his cruiser, out on his usual rounds. Deputy Castillo eased off the gas when he noticed a silver Dodge Stratus car pulled over in the breakdown lane on a rural highway outside of 𝗙𝗙 𝗙𝗡𝗏𝗏. It was pitch black and there wasn't much traffic. Castillo figured there wasn't a reason for anyone to stop right there unless they were having car trouble, so he decided he would walk over and see if they needed any help. Castillo pulled his cruiser in behind the car. He could see that the car's engine was still running and the high beam lights were on, and the passenger side door was wide open. Just ahead of the car on the side of the road, Castillo saw a pole with an emergency phone box attached to it. He thought maybe the passenger in this car had jumped out of the car after it pulled over to go use that call box to call for help, because maybe their car had broken down. But then Castillo noticed a woman's bare foot sticking out of that open passenger door, and he knew right then something had to be wrong. Castillo radioed to let dispatch know what he'd found and that he was now going to go investigate. Then Castillo got out of the cruiser, put his right hand on his holster, and began walking towards the back of the Dodge. Castillo's footsteps on the gravel were the only sound. Castillo saw what looked like a smear of blood on the back passenger side door, but he went around to the driver's side and he saw right away the front window was smashed, and Castillo saw a scene of pure horror inside the car. A man was slumped over in the driver's seat, still wearing a seatbelt, and a woman who had been in the passenger seat was sprawled across the front seat, basically on the driver, with her head on the man's lap. Both of them had been shot multiple times, and they were drenched in blood, and when Castillo checked both of them for a pulse, he found they had none. They were both dead. Castillo rushed back to his cruiser, and he radioed dispatch to tell them that he had just walked up on 2 apparent homicide victims out on Ortega Highway. Then Castillo ran the plates on the Dodge Stratus, and the vehicle came back as being registered to Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And while he couldn't know for sure quite yet, Castillo was reasonably certain that those were the 2 victims. After getting Castillo's message, the sheriff's office assigned 2 veteran detectives, Joe Holmes and James McDonald, to lead the potential murder investigation. They arrived on the lonely stretch of road on Ortega Highway at about 1 a.m. The area was already alive, with crime scene technicians and sheriff's deputies gathering up evidence, photographing the victims, and just trying to make sense of the baffling scene. The deputies who were already at the scene informed Detectives Holmes and McDonald that the victims were indeed Ken and Carolyn Stahl. And based on the scene in the car, the deputies believed that Ken had been shot first and then Carolyn. Detective Holmes looked closely at the 2 bodies inside the car, and he thought the deputies were probably right. He thanked them for their help and then did an initial search of the car and the surrounding area. And honestly, Holmes was kind of impressed by how little physical evidence had been left behind at the scene. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no skid marks, no bullet casings, and no weapon. Whoever did this had been very thorough, leaving law enforcement with almost nothing to work with. But then Holmes and McDonald did an extensive examination of the bloody interior of the car, and they began to discover some clues. Carolyn was covered in expensive jewelry, and the only piece that was missing was a single earring that had fallen on the ground. Likewise, Ken had plenty of cash and credit cards in his wallet, but nothing of value had been taken, so this didn't look like a robbery. The two detectives saw that both victims had been shot multiple times from outside the car. One bullet had gone through the driver's side door, and the others through the open window. So this could not be a traditional murder-suicide either. Somebody else had fired 8 to 12 bullets into Carolyn and Ken and then left them for dead. To Holmes and McDonald, this honestly looked like a mob hit, and the shootings had a depressing familiarity to McDonald. In his years as a detective, he had investigated multiple murders on this highway, Ortega Highway. There was the farmhand who was found buried in a shallow grave, and the dead man in the trunk of an abandoned car. McDonald sometimes thought that Ortega Highway was pretty much just a place for killers to dispose of bodies. But he just couldn't begin to understand how two middle-aged, very successful doctors from a wealthy gated community could wind up slaughtered in this desolate place. Word that Carolyn and Ken had been gunned down on a rural mountain road near San Juan Capistrano immediately dominated the news. The seemingly random quality of the shooting sent a shiver across the whole region of Southern California where Carolyn and Ken lived, and it left Ken and Carolyn's family and friends almost speechless. No one could imagine somebody hating the couple so much that they needed to kill them. The owner of the eye care clinic where Carolyn practiced joked that Carolyn was so kind they deliberately gave her the grumpiest patients because she could always cheer them up. And Ken's colleagues spoke equally highly of him. A doctor who had served on a state board with Ken said that he was revered by other doctors for his wise medical judgment. And friends also pointed out that the couple worked all the time, often 6 days a week. Ken provided anesthesia for surgeries at multiple medical facilities, so he had a complex, unpredictable schedule. And Carolyn was so devoted to her practice that she had previously canceled vacation plans to avoid inconveniencing her colleagues. So their friends wondered when they would even have time to have made enemies. And early on, investigators struggled with the same question. On December 4th, so 2 weeks after the murders, hundreds of mourners crowded into St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Huntington Beach, California. They cried together, they comforted each other, and they celebrated Carolyn and Ken's lives. Ken's 87-year-old mother made her way to the front of the crowd. She said she had always braced herself for the possibility that her son might die young because of his bad heart, but nothing had prepared her for her son's violent end. Then she broke down in tears and said all she wanted to do was hold her son one more time. In the days following the funeral, Detectives McDonald and Holmes still didn't have much encouraging news for Ken and Carolyn's families, but their investigative team was still very busy. At a separate memorial service held for Ken by his colleagues, deputies had asked all the attendees to sign in a guest book. They wanted to know who was there, and they wanted to compare handwriting samples to documents they had collected from where Ken and Carolyn lived and worked to see if they could find anything connecting Ken's colleagues to the killings. But after a few weeks into the investigation, Holmes and McDonald still didn't have a suspect in mind, but they were getting a better picture of the killer. The autopsy confirmed that both Carolyn and Ken had been killed by multiple gunshots sometime between the hours of 8:30 p.m. and 10 p.m., so not long before Deputy Castillo had found the car. Also, a separate ballistics analysis found that all the gunshots came from a single gun, most likely a .357 Magnum revolver. That gave Holmes and McDonald a couple of key pieces of information. First, Ken and Carolyn were most likely murdered by a single gunman. And second, the killer was cold and collected. They had fired at least 8 shots from a revolver that held only 6 bullets, meaning the shooter had to stop in the middle of the murders, reload their weapon, and start firing again. Those reports forced Holmes and McDonald to think about the last minutes of Carolyn's life. Her husband was dead, and she was all alone in a cold, dark, strange place. Meanwhile, her killer was casually reloading their gun so they could shoot more bullets into her. I mean, this was a truly awful way to go. And that information pushed the detectives to dig even deeper into Carolyn and Ken's lives in the hope they would find something that would lead them to the killer. And in doing this deep dive, Holmes and McDonald soon discovered that Carolyn and Ken's 14-year marriage was not nearly as perfect as some of their grieving friends and relatives had thought. Some of the couple's loved ones had come forward and told the detectives that Carolyn and Ken had problems, a lot of problems. Carolyn's sister Linda actually reached out and asked to meet with the detectives. She said she didn't want to speak ill of the dead, but she really needed them to know the truth. And so, on a cool December day, Linda arrived at the sheriff's station, and she followed Holmes and McDonald into a small, comfortable office. And within a few seconds of sitting down, Linda went on an absolute tirade about her brother-in-law, Ken. She told the detectives that Ken had a history of cheating that began way before he even met Carolyn. Ken's first marriage had ended because Ken had an affair. Then, Ken had married the woman he had the affair with, but that marriage also fell apart within just 3 months. Linda said her sister Carolyn was well aware of Ken's romantic history when she had moved in with him back in 1984. But Carolyn was determined to make a better man of him. And after they had been living together for a year, Carolyn gave Ken an ultimatum: marry her, or the relationship would be over. Ken had told friends he never wanted to get married again, but he reluctantly gave in to Carolyn's demand. Linda said their marriage actually seemed to go pretty smoothly for a while. Carolyn was close with Ken's mother, and she was also close with Ken's son from his first marriage, and with 2 doctors' incomes, they made a ton of money, and so their future looked quite bright. Suddenly, Linda trailed off and just stopped talking. The detectives asked her if she needed a break, or if they could get her anything, but she said she did want to keep going. She needed to get this all out. Then Linda took a deep breath and composed herself, and told the detectives that things had taken a really bad turn for her sister about 5 years earlier. She said Carolyn had come home from visiting family in Michigan, and she found a woman she didn't know eating fast food on the couch in her living room. The woman was just as surprised as Carolyn, and she fled the house immediately, but Ken had admitted he was romantically involved with that woman. Linda said she had hoped her sister would just leave Ken right then and there, but she didn't. Instead of demanding a divorce, Carolyn had demanded marriage counseling. But even with marriage counseling, Ken's behavior didn't change. He had at least 3 more affairs that Linda said she was aware of, and she said his address book was still full of women's names and phone numbers. Linda clutched the arms of her chair tight, and she fought back tears while she talked about her sister. But she took a deep breath and continued her story. She told the detectives that she had been so angry at Ken that she finally confronted him about his chronic cheating and about how much he was hurting her sister. One of the detectives asked how Ken responded to that, and Linda gave a slight laugh and shook her head, and then she said Ken had just shrugged his shoulders and told her that, he was the person he was, and Carolyn just had to accept that. Finally, Linda told the detectives that Carolyn went to great lengths to hide the ugly truth about her marriage. Carolyn was always very careful to give the impression of marital bliss to friends and coworkers. She would even buy herself her own Christmas presents. She would wrap them and put tags on them that said they were from Ken, even though obviously they were not, and she would put them under the tree, and so that when friends and family came over, they would see how good Ken was being to his wife. And Ken just played along with this for the sake of appearances. Linda said one of the reasons Carolyn was buying all these gifts for herself is because she believed buying nice things for herself made her happy. She called it retail therapy. But Linda knew her sister better than anybody, and she knew no matter what Carolyn did, no matter what she bought, no matter how nice it was, nothing could change the fact that Ken had totally broken her heart. The detectives shared a look. Linda's retail therapy comment had just potentially cleared up a question they'd had for weeks. When they had searched Carolyn and Ken's home right after the murders, they found nearly $30,000 in brand new women's clothing and accessories. A lot of it was actually still wrapped in plastic, with the price tags still attached. That had really confused the detectives at the time, but now it kind of made sense. The detectives thanked Linda for all her help, and then they walked her out of the station. McDonald and Holmes hadn't let on in front of her, but Linda's revelations about Ken and Carolyn's troubled relationship opened up a world of potential murder suspects. Did a former girlfriend take revenge on Ken for leaving her? Or did a jealous husband of one of the women that Ken had an affair with lash out? There was even a chance that Ken had been the lone target of one of those jilted lovers or angry husbands, and Carolyn had just happened to be with him at the time of the murder. With this new information, the detectives now wanted to dig into all of Ken's communications with all the women he was potentially having affairs with. Like most doctors in the 1990s, Ken carried a pager, which is a small electronic device that buzzes and gives a phone number to call when somebody needs you. The detectives got Ken's pager and they contacted every phone number on it. This at least allowed them to reconstruct key parts of Ken's last day. The detectives found a fellow anesthesiologist who paged Ken around 8 p.m. on the night of the murder. This other anesthesiologist had hoped that Ken could cover for him at a surgery the next morning. The doctor said Ken sounded normal when they talked and that Ken was out celebrating his wife's birthday. So McDonald and Holmes reasoned that whatever happened to the couple that night probably caught them completely by surprise. McDonald also came across a Mexican immigrant named Adriana Vasco who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders. She explained that she had become friends with Ken several years earlier when she worked in the office at the National Pain Institute where he was a part-time anesthesiologist. Adriana said that Ken had agreed to get her desktop computer repaired, and she had paged him to find out how the repairs were going. McDonald was immediately suspicious of this. He couldn't understand why a busy doctor would be volunteering to repair computers on the side. The detective asked Adriana flat out if she was having an affair with Ken, but she denied it. Adriana insisted that Ken was just a very generous guy. He had helped her out financially numerous times over the years. The call with Adriana lasted only 5 minutes, but McDonald came away from it with the distinct sense that he had just been lied to. But he had no evidence to back up his gut feeling, so he let it drop, at least for the moment. Over the coming days, McDonald and Holmes repeatedly asked Ken's family and friends what they knew about Adriana Vasco. The detectives got nothing but blank stares. None of the friends or family had ever heard of her. Then, in late December, a woman contacted the detectives and admitted right at the start that she'd had an affair with Ken in the mid-1990s. And when she heard about the murders, she'd recalled a conversation she'd had with Ken back then. She said Ken had complained that he was being blackmailed by someone close to him and that he was not in control of his own life. The woman's story was chilling, and blackmail was not out of the realm of possibility. After all, Ken had had multiple affairs, and most people assumed he was rich because he was a doctor. But the detectives had also discovered that Ken's health issues had caused him to miss months of work in the past. That had led to some financial strain and had forced Ken and Carolyn to move out of their $700,000 home into the comfortable but much more modest condo where they had lived at the time of their deaths. The detectives also knew Carolyn had spent at least $30,000 on clothes and jewelry for herself. So now Holmes and McDonald wondered if the murders simply came down to money. Maybe Ken couldn't pay someone who was blackmailing him, so they killed him and his wife. But as 1999 came to an end, the detectives still had no major suspects. They had followed a bunch of different leads, but so far, nothing had paid off. However, both detectives had a strong feeling that cracking this case would begin with one of the women Ken had an affair with, and they thought that woman could be Adriana Vasco. Both detectives were confident she knew a lot more than she had told them, so it was time to have another conversation. On February 29, 2000, so over 3 months after the murders, detectives McDonald and Holmes met Adriana Vasco at her friend's house in Anaheim, California. Adriana was little, she was barely 5 feet tall, and she was quite thin. She was 33 years old and a single mother of 2 young kids. Over coffee at her kitchen table, Adriana told the detectives how she had become friends with Ken, a man who seemed to live in a completely different world than she did. She explained that Ken had noticed her walking with a limp when they were both working at the National Pain Institute. Ken had offered to inject pain medication into her back to correct the limp, but he told her it would be an ongoing procedure. At the kitchen table, Adriana took a sip of her coffee, and then a smile came across her face. She said she had agreed to the procedure, and as the pain injections continued, the two of them started getting a bit closer. Adriana said she had even begun calling him Ken instead of Dr. Stahl, and Ken had clearly taken a growing interest in Adriana's life. Then, when Adriana had split with her husband, Ken paid for her and her son to go live in a motel. When Adriana's car had broken down, Ken gave her money to buy a new one, a white Mazda. So Adriana told the detectives it became normal for her to turn to Ken for help because he was always so kind to her. And Adriana said that in return, she became a shoulder for Ken to cry on. He opened up to her about his unhappiness. He told her he hated the Orange County doctor's life. He thought it was totally phony. He said he had a lot more fun when he went to the beer and barbecue chicken restaurant, which was down the street from Adriana's apartment. Ken had even told Adriana at one point that she was his only real friend. Detectives McDonald and Holmes sat on the edge of their seats, wanting to ask Adriana again if she was actually romantically involved with Ken. But they held their tongues and just let her talk. Adriana continued and said that Ken's marriage had been empty for years. He complained about his wife's looks and her weight, and he said they mostly slept in separate bedrooms. Then Adriana began to cry. She apologized and said she was still in shock over Ken's death. She said when she found out he died, it was like her whole world had just collapsed. Ken was like her hero. Finally, after Adriana wiped the tears from her face, she looked across the table at the detectives and she admitted that she had had an affair with Ken. And Ken's wife, Carolyn, knew about it. She told the detectives that about 3.5 years earlier, she had received a phone call from Ken, but the moment she answered, Ken quickly handed the phone off to his wife Carolyn, and Carolyn's message to Adriana was blunt: "Stay away from my husband." Adriana said she broke off the affair soon after getting that phone call. She knew Ken would never divorce his wife, and she didn't want to get hurt. But she and Ken had remained friends even when Adriana found a new romantic partner and even had a daughter with him. In fact, Adriana said that Ken would sometimes go out to dinner with Adriana's new guy. Also, Adriana said after they split up, Ken never tried to have sex with her again. And she told the detectives that she really believed that Ken and Carolyn had genuinely started to work on their marriage at the time they got killed. And when she had spoken to Ken on the day he was killed, Adriana said he sounded happier than he had in months. McDonald and Holmes had more questions for Adriana, but the coffees were long since cold and it was after 5 p.m., so they thanked her for her time and they headed for the door. By the summer of 2000, the sensational double murder that had once gotten so much media attention was increasingly in danger of going cold. McDonald and Holmes had come away from their interview with Adriana convinced that her grief over Ken's death was actually sincere. She was probably lying about the length of their affair, but the detectives couldn't see why Adriana would want Ken dead. He had been a ready source of money and support to her for years. So the hope that one of Ken's lovers would lead them to the truth about the murders began to fade, and the detectives hadn't found any evidence that Ken had been blackmailed by anybody. Holmes and McDonald continued to pursue every possible lead, and they re-interviewed anyone who seemed to be remotely connected to the case, but their investigation stalled. In the fall of 2000, about 10 months after the murders, McDonald and Holmes were reassigned to another unit, and two new detectives, Brian Heaney and Phil Villalobos, took over Carolyn and Ken's murder case. Initially, the two new detectives felt totally overwhelmed. Villalobos had only been a homicide detective for 2 weeks, and Heaney's experience was mostly just in narcotics. But as they began to dig through the huge case file, they realized that their predecessors, McDonald and Holmes, were likely overwhelmed too. But something caught Detective Villalobos' eye as he reviewed Ken's cell phone records from the day of his death. Ken had called the same number 4 times, and the calls were to the same person who had paged Ken on the morning of the murders, Adriana Vasco. So Villalobos and Heaney quickly decided to pick up where the previous detectives had left off, and they turned their focus to Adriana. And at 8 p.m. on October 11th, almost 11 months after the murders, Adriana arrived at the sheriff's station for another interview. But this time, she was not eager to help. Adriana insisted that on the day of Ken's murder, she had only contacted him to talk about those computer repairs, and that the conversation was so innocuous that she couldn't even remember anything else they talked about. The two detectives pressed Adriana hard to get her to say more. Villalobos even asked her straight out who killed Ken. But Adriana broke into tears and said she had no idea and genuinely could not remember anything substantive from their last conversation. The detectives would question Adriana really aggressively for several hours until finally it was clear she just didn't have anything else to say, so they let her go. But the detectives were not quite finished with Adriana. After she left, the detectives rushed outside after her and hopped in their car and followed her. After driving for several minutes, Adriana arrived at a house where the father of one of her children was waiting for her. Adriana and this man had split up, but they remained close for the sake of their daughter. The detectives watched Adriana with this man from a distance, and they began to develop a new theory. Maybe Adriana did have nothing to do with Ken's death, but maybe this man who she was with, the father of her daughter, had gotten jealous of her affair with Ken, and maybe he lashed out. And so now maybe Adriana was doing everything she could to protect him, really just so her young daughter would not be without her father. Villalobos and Heaney waited for Adriana to leave, and then after she had, they hopped out of their car, walked up to the front door, knocked, and then when the man came to the door, they led him to the front yard to question him. And to the detective's surprise, this man was completely open and asked how he could help. Villalobos told him that he was convinced someone close to Adriana had killed Ken and Carolyn Stahl, but the detectives didn't know who. The man said that made sense to him, and he understood why they would want to question him, but then this man said something that sent Villalobos and Heaney reeling. He told them that he had nothing to do with Carolyn and Ken's murders, but he had a pretty good idea of who probably killed them. Villalobos just stared at him and then asked him outright, okay, who's the killer? And the man would say one word, Tony. The detectives were caught off guard. In all those files from nearly a year-long investigation, the name Tony had never once come up. Now they had someone telling them a guy named Tony was probably the killer they had been looking for. The detectives followed up with a bunch more questions about who this Tony person was, and they would learn that Tony was Adriana's current boyfriend, and he was a handyman at her apartment building. He also had a long criminal rap sheet, he had a temper, and he loved guns. A few days later, Detective Heaney was waiting in an unmarked car outside the hospital where Adriana worked. Investigators had been trying to track down Adriana's boyfriend, Tony, but the man seemed to have disappeared. So Heaney wanted Adriana to help them find him. Eventually, Adriana walked outside, still dressed in her scrubs, and right away Heaney rushed up to her and caught her completely by surprise. He asked her point blank if she would take a polygraph test right now. He said the test was all set up at the local police station right around the corner. All she had to do was come with him. Adriana was clearly shocked and pretty angry with Heaney for surprising her like this, but she did go with him to the police station. During the polygraph test, Adriana faced round after round of very difficult questions from Heaney and Villalobos, and Adriana held her ground, denying any knowledge of the murders. But then, Heaney hit her with a surprise question. He asked if Tony was the killer. She tried to deny knowing Tony, but it was already too late. The detectives knew he was her boyfriend and that she was lying to them. So Heaney began asking rapid-fire questions about Tony. Where was he? Did he know Ken? But Adriana collected herself, and she insisted she had no answers for them. But the detectives were convinced Adriana was now the key to unlocking this case, and too many people had been working for too long on this investigation to let this opportunity slip away. And it turned out the detectives had one more surprise for Adriana. There was an outstanding warrant for her arrest for driving with a suspended license, and they were going to use that to lock her up for the night. Adriana begged to be allowed to go home to her kids, but the detectives handcuffed her and led her to a cell. Now they just had to find Tony. Even after being locked up, Adriana did not tell the detectives where her boyfriend Tony was. But her phone bill showed that she had repeatedly called a number in Greenville, North Carolina over the past couple of days, and Detective Villalobos had a hunch that those were calls to Tony. Villalobos sent a picture of Tony to local police in Greenville, and right away an officer in Greenville contacted him and said he recognized Tony. He told Villalobos that Tony actually went by the name Dennis Godley in Greenville, but the local cops just called him the Weasel because he was so good at eluding arrest. However, the officer in Greenville said he would still be able to lead Villalobos and his partner right to Tony. So detectives Villalobos and Heaney headed right to the airport and took a flight from California to North Carolina. And while they were there, they did meet and interview Tony. However, he was totally uncooperative. He claimed that he had never been close to Adriana and that he had absolutely no role in the death of Ken and Carolyn Stahl. The detectives flew home feeling frustrated and with almost no new information, but their plan with Adriana had worked. After spending the night in jail and worrying she would not get to go home to her kids, she was now finally ready to tell the detectives everything she knew about Tony and everything she knew about Ken and Carolyn's murders. And by the time Adriana was finished talking, detectives Villalobos and Heaney were ready to make arrests in a case that had now gone on for almost a year. Based on Adriana's jail cell interview and evidence collected by both teams of detectives throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Carolyn and Ken Stahl out on Ortega Highway on November 20th, 1999. On that November day, the killer sat in the passenger seat of a parked car not far from the restaurant in San Juan Capistrano, where Ken and Carolyn were celebrating Carolyn's birthday. The killer calmly loaded their .357 Magnum and made small talk with the driver. But the driver wasn't listening. They had their eyes focused on the road right outside of the restaurant. Then the driver suddenly told the killer to be quiet. Ken's Dodge Stratus had just pulled out onto the road. The driver waited to let Ken's car get a little further away. Then the driver started their car, pulled out and tracked Ken onto Ortega Highway. The highway was dark and oddly quiet. The driver gripped the steering wheel tight and closed in on Ken. Meanwhile, the killer just kept talking like nothing out of the ordinary was even happening. Then at some point, Ken's car pulled off the highway into the breakdown lane near an emergency phone box. The driver told the killer it was time to act. Then the driver hit the gas, raced by Ken's car, and then did a U-turn into the breakdown lane. The driver's headlights were now shining directly into Ken's windshield. The driver put the car in park, and then the killer casually stepped out of the car. The killer walked right up to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass, and Ken rolled the window down. Ken was about to say something when the killer casually raised the .357 Magnum and fired. The bullet hit Ken behind the left ear and exited through his right eye. Carolyn began to scream from the passenger seat and tried to undo her seatbelt, but she was in shock and her hands were shaking and so she couldn't get free. The killer then fired another shot into Ken, and this time the bullet shredded his aorta, the body's main artery, and so blood sprayed all over the car and Ken slumped over, dead. Carolyn finally got her seatbelt off, but by this point the killer stuck his gun through the open driver's side window and fired multiple shots point blank at Carolyn, hitting Carolyn in the chest. Carolyn screamed again and blood began to pour down her shirt, but she was still alive. So the killer aimed the gun at her and fired again, but they were out of bullets. So as Carolyn is sitting there slowly dying and screaming and looking at her dead husband, the killer walked back to the other car. They opened up the passenger side door, shouted something at the driver, and then grabbed extra ammunition from a bag on the floor. Then the killer calmly reloaded their gun and then turned back and began walking towards Ken's car again. By this point, the killer saw the passenger side door of the Dodge Stratus was now open. Carolyn tumbled out of the car and one of her earrings fell to the ground. She was covered in blood and struggling to breathe, but she managed to brace herself against the back door of the car and stay on her feet. Carolyn looked around for any kind of escape route, but then she heard something behind her. She turned and saw the killer walking towards her with their gun raised. There was nowhere to go. In a last, desperate attempt to save herself, Carolyn dove back inside the car head first. One of her red shoes fell off as she struggled to pull herself across the front seat of the car over the body of her dead husband. She was trying to get to the driver's side so that maybe she could speed away and save herself. But the killer just walked to the open passenger door, aimed their gun at the back of Carolyn's head, and fired off 2 more shots. Carolyn fell over dead in Ken's lap. The killer leaned in to make sure both Ken and Carolyn were dead. Then they did a thorough sweep of the car and the road around it to make sure they picked up any stray evidence, like bullet casings. Finally, when the killer was satisfied, they walked back to the white Mazda that was still parked with its lights shining directly into Ken's car. Then the killer got back into the Mazda and looked over at the driver. And the driver was shaking and horrified. The killer told the driver to calm down and just get out of here. But the driver shouted at the killer that they were not supposed to kill Ken. The driver said she loved Ken, and Ken was actually the one who had paid them to murder his wife. It would turn out Adriana was the driver, and her boyfriend, Tony, had indeed pulled the trigger and killed Carolyn and Ken. But Ken had actually been the one who set the entire thing in motion. It turned out Ken had wanted his wife dead for a long time. He wanted to be free to have relationships with lots of women without any repercussions and just to live his life however he wanted. But Ken felt like he was reliant on Carolyn. She took care of him and she made a lot of money, so if his health issues kept him from working again, he would still be able to live well because of Carolyn. Ken went so far as to tell some people that Carolyn had control of his life, and it was like he was being blackmailed just to stay in the marriage, even though that was just not true. But finally, Ken told Adriana that he had just had enough, and he asked her to help him murder his wife. Adriana said her boyfriend Tony would be perfect for the job. He was good with guns and calm in any situation. So Ken paid Adriana and Tony $30,000 to carry out a hit on Carolyn. And Ken and Adriana hammered out all of the details, including the exact location on Ortega Highway where Ken would pull over and the murder would go down. On the day of the murder, Ken had contacted Adriana multiple times to let her know when he and Carolyn were heading to the restaurant, and then when they arrived, and then also when they were leaving. And Adriana and Tony had been waiting nearby to follow him to the spot they'd agreed on. But when it came time to actually do the job, Tony took things into his own hands. He didn't trust Ken, and he didn't want the middle-aged doctor around to pin the whole thing on him. So Tony decided to just kill Ken too. Carolyn was truly just an innocent victim. Her husband had plotted against her and had even tried to paint her as some kind of blackmailing monster. But Carolyn's friends and family knew that despite all of Ken's cheating, Carolyn still loved him, and she still believed they could repair their marriage. But Ken had no intention of doing that. At trial, Adriana insisted that she tried to talk Ken out of going through with the shooting, and that she ultimately only went along with it because she was afraid of Tony. But ultimately, a jury would convict her of masterminding the entire murder plot and sentenced her to life in prison without parole. As for Tony, he would ultimately plead guilty to the murders in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. And Tony would insist to the very end that Adriana was the one who shot Carolyn, not him. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.